And there was an immediate rush by the media to pin this to the growing phenomenon of violence against Asian Americans. Now, it seems in this instance the media was too quick, as often is the case, to put it down to racism, since the latest we've discovered is that this man seems to have been a sort of sex-mad sociopath, I think. That seems to be a fair description. But we don't quite know all the details of the case. But it is kind of typical, isn't it, that the media put it down to racism before they knew any cause.
Yeah, I think so. For people who are familiar with my work, they probably know of me for my writings and reportings on Antifa. And I don't normally talk about my Asian American identity. It very rarely has intersected with the narrow beats that I'm on. But I do think it's important for me to be speaking about my views on the very cynical exploitation of the mass shootings that happened in Atlanta. So Asian Americans has been kind of a relatively ignored demographic for both the political left and the right. Part of the reason being that we are a smaller demographic population, and we are not really situated in states that are important swing states in the same way that Black and Hispanic Americans are. And by and large, many young Asian Americans have been able to sort of avoid the siren calls of critical race theory, just because by all the metrics that measure integration, Asian Americans have done extremely well in terms of income, education, health, etc. So these victimhood narratives that come out of critical race theory generally don't appeal to a lot of us. But I think the cynical hard left and the legacy American media have been really trying to pull this demographic into their field to build this coalition of different, what they'd say are oppressed minorities against the white demographic majority. And they used irresponsibly the shootings in a way that is, I find, very personally offensive. So as we found out pretty quickly from both the local investigators and as well as the head of the FBI, there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that this was somehow racially motivated. And everything we know so far, based on what the suspect who's been apprehended has said himself, is that it's related to his sexual addiction issues, which we know from his family that he's received medical treatment for. So I think all these other issues that we could really be talking about based on the evidence, like, for example, mental health in America, the intersection with violence and guns, as well as the other thing that people aren't comfortable talking about is that these massage parlors are quite frequently a front for sex services and sexual abuse rings involving migrant women. And that appears to likely be the case on here based on the various websites that featured these so-called massage parlors. So that particular narrative is falling apart. But I think this wider discussion about racially motivated attacks against Asian Americans, I appreciate that it's happening regardless, but we're not properly diagnosing it in the discourses that are happening within the mainstream press. It's all being focused around the prism and ideological framework of CRT, which blames whiteness and white supremacy for everything.
I suppose that's why the media was so quick to jump onto this, was it was a white killer, and so it could easily be sort of stamped as a white supremacist crime before we knew any details. But it is true nonetheless. There is this phenomenon of rising violence against Asian Americans. And I wondered from what you said there, whether you think part of the violence against Asian Americans is motivated by the success that Asian Americans have had in integrating as a community. They are not as downtrodden, as oppressed as other minority groups. And so therefore often other minority groups feel violent towards them. Is that a fair thing to speculate about?
I haven't read any of the academic literature that has looked into trying to find the causations for violent crimes on Asian American victims, but I have been looking into the data released by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is under the DOJ in the U.S. And they do have some pretty sobering data on the race of victims and offenders in violent crimes and incidents. So according to the 2018 data, around 27.5% of violent offenders against Asian victims in the United States are Black. That's pretty sobering when you also factor in that Black Americans are only around 13% of the population. The inverse of that, in terms of Blacks being victimized by an Asian offender in violent incidents, is less than 0.1%. And if you do the math, you can simplify it as for every single Black victim of Asian on Black violence in the US, there are approximately around 5,000 Asian victims of Black and Asian violence.
Right.
So I think these narratives around white supremacy and all that, they don't hold up under the scrutiny of the data. The same thing goes for if you scrutinize the claims made by Black Lives Matter, for example, or Antifa, or any of these hard left movements. And I think this rush to judgment to assume that because the apprehended suspect in the Atlanta shootings is white, that this was a white supremacist attack, which some politicians are still going on despite what the FBI has said. I find that very troubling. I mean, that is the same impulse to assume then that, for example, if a Muslim was implicated in a crime, that they were doing it because of their religion, or, it's like that same type of very reductive reactionary rush to judgment, except it's being encouraged when a perpetrator or a suspect is white.